I think that in life there always has to be a time where we kind of sit back and analyze like how much we've changed and how much of us has succumbed to change in our lives. Like for me, for example, I feel like in the past I was far too pushed by my ambition to get more attention from people, and maybe I would try to reach it in ways that probably weren't the best for me or best for other people, like annoying outbursts or some other thing, all because I needed a little bit more attention. Now, that kind of change, I feel, always turns into something else, and I think that it's that way for for a lot of people, like regardless of how we feel about a situation, and regardless about how we feel about something that happened in the past that still impacts us, it either manifests itself in a different way that's positive or it does so negatively. And I feel like we have to be the ones to create the distinction and be able to kind of turn that into something positive, whereas it could be easily negative. And that's not to say like I don't enjoy the person that I'm becoming, because I definitely do. Who I am as a person has went from something I was kind of spiteful over to something I'm very prideful of. Like I feel like we should be prideful in who we are as people, whether or not we have a clear cut definition of who we are as people.
Yes. Period.
How do you find out who you are?
I think that there's a lot of ways to find out who you are. I think for me, it was just the way that I was raised and with my parents. Like, from the time that I was in kindergarten to the time that I was in like eighth grade, my mom, before we went to school, would make us say these affirmations. And every day before we left the house, we'd have to say, I'm smart, I'm pretty, and I can do anything because God loves me. And we'd have to say that every day for, what is that, like 8, 9 years, something like that. And I think that the more you start to like tell yourself things, the more you start to believe them. And so I think that that is a part of how I found out who I was, because I was never told that I wasn't good enough or that I wasn't something, you know what I mean? Yeah. So I always believed that I was smart. I always believed that I was pretty. I never believed anything otherwise. And so I just feel like my parents played a big role in me. I don't know. I feel like it's not even me finding out who I was, but me just always knowing who I was, you know?
How do you find out who you are?
I think finding out who you are is a process of going through a lot of pain and struggle and failures in life. Because as much as the good times define us as who we are as people, I feel like the bad times help us figure out ourselves even more, because there's beauty in the struggle at the end of the day. So I believe that, like, yeah, hard times, that's how we find out who we are.
How do you find out who you are?
You find out who you are by looking at your community and the influence around you and kind of taking that within yourself and seeing what resonates with you and what doesn't, and kind of building yourself from that.
Like I'm definitely enjoying the person I'm becoming. Like I have no doubt in my mind that the younger me would have probably idolized someone like me, someone who I am today. Like I've developed a kind of strength physically and mentally that I think is pretty admirable. Whether or not like my mental fortitude is up to par, because sometimes it's not, but that's everybody. And I think never truly knowing what we want as people, like having these desires and outlets for life pushed in our face, it kind of makes it more difficult to try to decide what truly we want. Because like pride is something that affects all of us, and I'll touch more on that later. But I feel like a lot of times people try to look for outlets in things that are definitely, you know, more dependent or less dependent on the thoughts and ideas and opinions of other people. So this sort of thing for me is something very important. I feel like I'm more grateful to this type of philosophical outlook at life than I am for many things in life. It was like the works of like Alan Watts, who's a philosopher who died not too long ago, kind of taught me how to shift perspective. and turn myself into someone who used to be angry all the time to someone who is in like not 100% but decent control of how I feel. And it was all of these sort of spouts of philosophy. And I don't want to say like, I don't want to give myself too much credit and say that my philosophy isn't based on the philosophy of others. However, like, I just needed to be like almost introduced to the subject area in order to realize that my brain can like mesh and work with certain things like that. Um, and all of that led me to into this like this cycle of like existence, like being aware that I'm a thinking thing, like I'm the subject of my own life. That is, I feel like a lot of us though do have that consciousness aspect to ourselves, like we are conscious of what we do and how it impacts others. But I feel like for like healing or like a spiritual level of consciousness, we have to somewhat embody that physically. And do we convince ourselves of self-worth?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think we do and we don't. I believe that sometimes that can be like depending on your upbringing, like depending on the values that people instill that your parents instill in you. Like you can, they can teach you your self worth. They can teach you about your self worth, or they don't. And then if they don't, then you have to go through life without having to find that. So I think in that aspect, you would convince yourself of it. But I believe that if you grow up with the idea that you have self worth inherently, if your parents instilled that idea in you, I don't think it's that you necessarily convince yourself of that once you grow up. So.
Thank you. Do we convince ourselves of self-worth?
Convince is a very interesting word. Do we convince ourselves? I think it starts out with convincing, like a fake it till you make it type thing, where you have to just start telling yourself things and then eventually you start to believe it. And so I think that it's like at first you do convince yourself, but eventually it's not convincing, you just automatically believe it. You know?
Indeed.
Yeah.
I think we do, because I think we convince ourselves of our self-worth by also surrounding us by things that make us feel worthy, like the people we surround us with. If you feel like you're worth good people, you're going to surround yourself with good people, and they're going to make you feel like you're worth being surrounded by good people. So I feel like it's a cycle, and that doesn't just go for people, but like also the community and the environment that you put yourself in reflects your self-worth too. So you can change that, which means that you can make it happen.
Thank you.
Anytime.
That's your heart, really?
Now, that's not like you have to be strong or like your willpower will automatically make you look a certain way, but it's like actively looking for those parts of you that need a little light shed on them and becoming a better person like actively and intentionally rather than expecting change to just happen because we're aware that something needs to be changed. But is it supposed to have like a real physical form? I think we can't force something like that. However, I think things like consciousness and that type of physical platform that I'm talking, you need like a proper foundation. Now, that brings me to like the question of like strength and whether or not strength is like being able to stand on your own unsupported or being strong enough to accept help from others. Because I feel like in a man in today's society, we're kind of pushed and taught that we're supposed to stand alone, don't take handouts, you know, suppress a lot of the things that would make us unstable per se. And I feel like that's what breeds most of the instability. Most of us are hurt a little bit inside, and we don't have a proper way to get rid of those feelings. And I feel like once we do, it becomes so foreign. Because like me myself, I have stuff I'm working on now, and it's definitely a challenge because it's not something I'm used to actively working on. I had once thought that just being neglectful or bettering my body or something like that would just get rid of all my mental anguish, but you have to like get down to root causes and also like realize and differentiate what needs to be like kicked out your mind and what needs to be addressed. To touch on what I said earlier, we all have pride. Like, we're all prideful things. We all have sin. And I feel like it's the way we express it that has that connotation. Like, I feel like lust and desire are somewhat synonymous. It's just a certain level of desire. And we can desire something so much that's beneficial to us and other people around us. Beneficial to us and other people around us. And it shouldn't necessarily have that connotation to it. It should be as it is. It's like our mind, body, and soul are in a constant state of conflict. And to determine the victor of this battle or war, we have to like realize the impact of all three in conjunction. And that's kind of difficult to do because we're not actively working on all of them at the same time. So where a battle can be won, like where you realize that your mind is playing, mind is probably playing tricks on you or something like that, is only like a piece to the puzzle that is existing.
How do you find out who you are?
Well, I'm asking all three questions.
Okay. What was the first one again?
What is self-love?
Self-love it's simple. It's loving yourself, putting yourself first, you know, prioritizing yourself. And I think that it's something that is easier said than done, but I think that over time it's something that becomes easier. I think self-love is about choosing yourself, you know, and not even that, but just like loving yourself enough to not allow people to make you feel a certain way, or not allowing yourself to take abuse from other people, whether that's like your family or your friends or whoever. I think it's about wanting more for yourself and then going out and seeking that.
I think that self-love is just overall appreciating yourself. A lot of times we tend to focus on like loving other people before we love ourselves, and I think that self-love is just taking that steps to ensure that you actually love yourself and you love who you are before you actually put yourself out there to love somebody or be loved by somebody else.
Self-love is treating yourself like someone else you love. So doing the things that you would do for someone you love for yourself, like taking care of your body, taking yourself out to eat and giving yourself good food, giving yourself time to rest and to play and also to learn.
But I feel like some of this could be combated by things like self-worth and self-love. But like is somewhat like arrogance or outward spoken confidence. In what ways does that attribute to like not actually having that worth? Is it because we like think that if you say something like that, you deep down inside think that it's the opposite, or we think that it should be something like inherent, something you shouldn't have to be working on? Like we should all try to value ourselves, but to what extent does a value you put on yourself become ingenuine? Like what is self-love anyway? Is it just taking care of yourself, or is it like just being selfish to your own benefit, so you solely get the benefit of whatever you're doing? Or is it acting to maintain the current image of you? I think that we think it's the latter because change is so stigmatized in our society, and it's difficult for us to change who we are as well as accept that we've changed as people. And I feel like once we tie down and think that we love a current version of ourselves, we think that change would mean that we don't love it. Like, why would you change something you love? But I think that we can love and experience change at the same time. Like, we can love ourselves and changing. Like, we can love how we're getting better every day. Like, just as Just as the leaves of a tree will come off during the fall, I feel like we should exemplify that as well. Like, have a version of self that is subject to change and allow yourself to be the dictator of whether that change is negative or positive. Like, be able to shed your own leaves knowing whole well that this self or these leaves will come back to you eventually. And you just have to put somewhat like a blind faith into who you are as a person. That's good enough for me.